So in today's video, we actually have some pretty bad news, especially since we're talking about Resident Evil movies. I'm gonna go over my full thoughts after the news, but that's right guys, Constantin Films is back at it again, and this time it looks like they might be hiring a new director for another reboot of the RE movies. What's interesting about this rumor is that it seems to be connected to another rumor that had some legitimacy roughly around a year ago that I covered on the channel, more specifically the Umbrella Chronicles movie. So before we get started with the news, for those of you that don't know what Constantin Films is, it's essentially a movie distribution company as well as a movie production company that's based off of Germany. Now, the reason I'm actually going to be mentioning their names a lot in this video is because they're the sole rights owners to the Resident Evil movies. So essentially, if you've seen a Resident Evil movie with Mila Jovovich, or you've seen the Netflix live action show, or as well as Welcome to Raccoon City, those all worked underneath Constantin Films, since as mentioned, they're the sole rights owners to live action Resident Evil. Now, I'm pretty sure the rights don't go over to like theater productions or obviously the CGI animated movies that we've had of Resident Evil. So anyways, that brings us to today's topic. We're essentially talking about a new rumor that's somewhat connected to a rumor that we kind of heard last year that did have some legitimacy. So the rumor actually involves Zach Gregor. Now, Zach Gregor is actually a director that's known for movies like The Barbarian, and recently he was actually offered by Sony to work as a director for the Clue reboot, which is, yeah, like Clue, like the board game, which is kind of weird. I didn't even know that there was a movie for Clue, but anyways, he basically turned that offer down from Sony Screen Gems, specifically due to the reason, well, apparently it's due to conflicts with like the amount that he was going to be paid. So instead, he actually offered to work, and he wanted to work on the new Resident Evil reboot movie. So that's essentially the rumor that comes from Jeff Sneider. Now, another bit of evidence that kind of supports this as well is that Zach Gregor just recently finished a movie called The Weapons, which is a horror movie. So I wouldn't be surprised if he basically went to Sony and said, no, I don't want to work on a Clue, I want to work on another horror movie, so let's go with Resident Evil. That to me seems very plausible, but of course this is just speculation. We don't 100% know. But the other thing that I should mention that kind of makes this rumor somewhat plausible is the fact that a year ago we did get confirmation about a Resident Evil movie that was actually going to start production last year in the same area that Welcome to Raccoon City shot up in Canada. Now, funny thing is that I actually did cover this on the channel. This was roughly a year ago, but what the video was about is that the Sudbury News, which is like a small area like off of like the Ontario province, as mentioned, that's exactly where they shot Welcome to Raccoon City. I actually think it's called Greater Sudbury, but I might be wrong. But anyways, that local newspaper posted an article online last year that suggested that the provincial government was actually getting funding, or they were going to give funding to a movie called Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles, as well as another show called Letterkenny. So yeah, apparently this movie was supposed to happen, but it never did, right? We never got production on a Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles movie. And there was also another rumor that was tied into this. Now, on top of this, like legit news that happened in Sudbury, there was also another bit of rumor that suggested that Umbrella Chronicles wasn't going to be like the game Umbrella Chronicles, like the Umbrella Chronicles that we know, which is like a rail shooter of like Resident Evil 1, 3, and as well as like Umbrella's End and stuff. It wasn't going to be that. It was basically, the rumor suggested that it was actually going to be a reboot of Resident Evil movies. So it was even going to go past Welcome to Raccoon City. It was going to replace it, and it was actually going to discuss Rebecca's story and Billy from Resident Evil 0. So that was basically a rumor that happened, and then there was another rumor that tied next to that, and then now a year later, since none of that ended up happening, we're getting this other rumor on top of that. So we're just a stack of rumors now, which if you guys know Resident Evil, it seems like that's always the case. So it definitely seems like this was a possibility, but of course we don't know if, Zach Gregor is in fact going to be working on this, or if the project was just shut down, since as mentioned, we haven't had any news on production details. They didn't shoot anything. So it seems like they were prepping to shoot in 2023, but that never happened. So now that we're in 2024, it is interesting that, Zach Gregor, there's a rumor that Zach Gregor is going to be filming this. Now, another thing I should mention is that one could also speculate that the reason no Umbrella Chronicles movie was actually worked on last year could be due to the fact that a year prior to that, in 2022, we actually got that horrendous live action Resident Evil. I'm talking about the Netflix Resident Evil show that was super cringy, that made absolutely no sense. And then after the season basically aired, Netflix shut it down because nobody liked it. So it could be, as mentioned, I'm definitely stepping into speculation here, but it wouldn't surprise me that, after the horrible thing that happened with Netflix's Resident Evil, that Constantin Films, maybe they smartened up and they were like, hold up, we're gonna work on more Resident Evil movies. Maybe we should take a break since this was, a colossal disaster of a show. So maybe we should take a break. Maybe we'll hire a different director. You could definitely go in that rabbit hole of speculation. Now, the other thing that I also mentioned in that previous video was that it seems like they're not going with the guy that directed Welcome to Raccoon City. And the reason I say this is because obviously this new Umbrella Chronicles and what it seems to be rumored as is a reboot. That obviously there's a rumor attached to it, as discussed, that it's going to talk about Rebecca Chambers. So that would kind of interfere with Welcome to Raccoon City, which tried to involve RE1 and RE2 and then skip RE3. Like the whole movie was a mess, but it seems to me like they're not going with Johannes Roberts' vision of his movies, and if anything, they're kind of just rebooting the whole thing once more, which to a lot of Resident Evil fans is going to sound insane, but it kind of just begs the question, why does Constantin Films, why are they trying so hard to essentially bring Resident Evil to live action? Now, the reason I think that they're probably trying really hard to make this Resident Evil work, just like how it did years ago with the Milla Jovovich movies, because say what you want about the Milla Jovovich movies, but they did sell really well outside of the US. I think in total, I searched it up online, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but apparently Google says that it actually ended up earning a $1.2 billion. And as mentioned, most of that money was from foreign markets. Basically, what I'm getting at here is that it seems that Constantin Films wants to hit gold again. They want to make a bunch of money off of Resident Evil, and they're probably seeing Fallout as being successful, Last of Us as being successful. And so what they did before with Milla Jovovich, they tried to replicate with Netflix's Resident Evil. But then if we speculate on that, and if that is the case, which seems logical for them to do it, since as mentioned, they made so much money back in the day with all of those Milla Jovovich movies, which doesn't work nowadays, right? Like we just had a Borderlands movie, which I heard flopped and a lot of people hated it. I didn't go watch it because I'm not a big Borderlands fan just in general, but you can't make crappy video game adaptations. You just can't. You know what I mean? You have to make actual good adaptations, and people will actually go and see it. Like they will pay money to go and watch it, or just they will subscribe for streaming services to go and watch it, like what happened with Fallout. But it's very confusing to me that these, it seems like the strat that they're using is the same strat that they used in the early 2000s, where video game movies weren't as good. It is worth noting as well that during that time, in the early 2000s, the Milla Jovovich movies were the highest earning video game to movie adaptation movies. But obviously, key word here is that at that time. Obviously now you can't do that. You can't just bring the same kind of garbage to screen and kind of just put a bunch of Resident Evil Easter eggs. You can't just do that and then just call it a day. It seems to me like the new trend or the new strat is to essentially make a good show that's based on the video game. Now, obviously, it kind of leads us to another question. Do I think that Constantin Films is able to do that? Do I think that that's possible? I definitely don't think so. Now, it is worth noting too that 2 years ago, my kind of view on things was completely different. I did think that it was somewhat possible, and mind you, this was before the Netflix Resident Evil show came out. That's what kind of shifted my perspective, because it seems like the Netflix Resident Evil show was just like a rehash of the same thing that the Milla Jovovich movies was. Even the going back to the future and then going to to the past, or I should say the present. That whole thing just was very reminiscent of the post-apocalyptic nature of the Milla Jovovich movies, which has no place in Resident Evil, I should say, because Resident Evil has never had a post-apocalyptic setting. If anything, we've actually had some games where you stop the bad guy from doing that, for example RE5, but it's never just been a post-apocalyptic The Walking Dead-esque kind of world, or Last of Us post-apocalyptic world. So that doesn't really make sense. But all that to say that after I watched the Netflix Resident Evil show, I definitely didn't have any faith in Constantine. It seems like they've learned nothing, and as mentioned, it seems like they're just using the same strat that they used in the early 2000s, and they were trying to do it now again. So I don't think they understand the whole concept of actually getting, giving fans what they want, especially when you got a bunch of promo for Welcome to Raccoon City that was oh yeah, we got a bunch of stuff, it's exactly like the games, but in reality, when we watched the movie, it was only certain areas of the game, and everything else was just original. For example, the mansion had a bunch of rooms that they didn't even showcase. You could enter the lab area through a piano. So if anything, it was very similar to Batman Begins, which was just wild to to me. So there was a lot of discrepancies with Welcome to Raccoon City. Not to mention Netflix's Resident Evil. We also had, like, I don't know if you guys remember the TV spot trailer where we had producers, executive producers, saying how they hired Resident Evil experts, and that makes absolutely no sense because everything that was in that show went against like canon of the games. So it made absolutely zero sense. So as mentioned, do I think that Constantin Films can, you know, make this work? Can they make a successful show like Fallout or Last of Us? Mind you, I don't know too much about Last of Us. I never watched the show. I did play the games, but anyways, I've heard that it's successful. But yeah, do I think that they can replicate those other shows? No, I definitely don't think so. It seems to me like Constantin Films is more interested in just making quick money and trying to use the same strat, which, you know, not to mention another kind of bit of evidence that kind of suggests this is when we looked at Welcome to Raccoon City, and when you looked at the credits, you actually saw an executive producer, and the executive producer that was there was Paul W.S. Anderson, which was very, at the time, it did really piss me off. And I mentioned this in my review for Welcome to Raccoon City. Obviously, as mentioned in that review, executive producers sometimes have really hands-on like control of everything that happens on set. And other times, executive producers can sometimes just be like not even present. I think sometimes just their name is part of the project, even though like they have nothing to do with it. So, but obviously, there's no supporting evidence that kind of confirms whether this was the case, whether Paul W.S. Anderson was a part of those movies heavily, or if he was just taking a backseat throughout the whole thing. I don't know. That was never confirmed. And it's been 2 years since Resident, or 3 years, I should say, since Welcome to Raccoon City released. So yeah, as mentioned, I definitely don't think Constantin Films knows what they're doing. I definitely don't trust that Hollywood knows what they're doing with Resident Evil, especially when we have insulting statements like, oh, we hired Resident Evil experts. Well, if you hired Resident Evil experts, you definitely didn't use them, right? So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on the whole situation. As mentioned, this is still rumored, so I don't want people to think that this is confirmed that we are getting Umbrella Chronicles. It just seems like the only real legitimate piece of evidence that we do have that Umbrella Chronicles was supposed to happen last year was due to the local Sudbury News article. But anyways, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to click this one right here, where I actually go over a bunch of secret details that you might have missed in Resident Evil Revelations. Anyways, thank you so much for watching.